Do you work in banking, finance, investment management, or in the finance department of any kind of company? Do you kind of hate it? Then this is the video for you. When I was back at university, I did a Bachelor of Finance and Bachelor of Politics, and in the favorite course that I did, I had a lecturer, his name was Ting Tang. In the last lecture, he stood and he looked out at the class of aspiring young professionals, hundreds of them, and said, "Finance is a waste of human potential." That's something that I just could never get out of my head. Although I worked in banking for years, I worked in Australia, in New York, and then in Hong Kong, I didn't feel like I was achieving anything. Of course, you get paid, but in terms of your day-to-day or the job satisfaction that you have, the feeling was incredibly low. Everyone talked about money and was obsessed with salary. Very few had that sense of satisfaction with their work that you could attribute to other professions. Banks themselves no longer even perform their most basic functions within the economy. Think about commercial banks. Since the financial crisis and due to the rules which have been applied to banks, which relate, for example, to counterterrorism finance, anti-money laundering, capital requirements, or whatever it may be, mean that banks now hardly even perform their most basic, most rudimentary functionality in the economy. Banks, we argue in finance and economics, are there to allocate capital efficiently and to its most productive target. But the fact is that today most banks are really just building societies. Most funds simply are index watches. Businesses that are in dire need of capital are considered too much of a risk. Banks are obsessed with shortening the tail. That means they want to focus more on the customers that already generate them revenue and not on the ones that could. Companies out there are then forced to go down paths such as shadow banking, look at alternative methods of financing, and banks are just accruing home loan after home loan. And a home is not an investment in the economy. It might be for an individual, but it's not a productive asset. Banks have become compliance machines. They're more interested with ticking boxes than they are with genuinely understanding their customers. There was a time when the bank that I was working for, HSBC, was on a tear. If I look back at 2007, they had more than 300,000 employees. And yet recently, HSBC announced that it would proceed with its plan to reduce its headcount by an additional 35,000. That means that at the end of all of this, they'll have 200,000 employees. Within 13 years, more than a third reduction in their workforce. HSBC isn't the only bank. It's just one example of many. These banks are out of date, but funds, investment banks, and other financial intermediaries are really no better. There's many reasons that we could go into about why finance is the way it is. And I'm not saying that banks and finance companies are necessarily victims, although I think that many pieces of well-intentioned legislation turned out being to the detriment of the economy and to individuals that need capital, that need financing. But at the end of the day, this video is not about that. This video is about you as an individual and do you enjoy working in finance? You don't get to see the product of your labor. The product of your labor is simply a number at the end of the year that hopefully contributes towards your bonus. You don't build anything, and oftentimes you're not helping companies or individuals build anything. You're really just in it for the money. There's some aspects of finance that are really great. Like, for example, I really appreciated the fact that I could work anywhere in the world. But that's not something that's restricted to finance. And so I would argue that it's not an excuse to remain in an industry if you're not enjoying it. Finance, if we look back at the last 20, 30 years, the service economy became more and more pervasive throughout every single company in the economy. Every single company has a finance department. Every single company needed to manage its assets and liabilities. They needed to manage their debt maturity cycles. They needed to manage their costs. And I would argue that the new finance is tech. For a long time, companies who weren't tech companies could get away with not having a very sophisticated tech department, or in some cases not having a tech department at all. But today, almost every company has a tech department, and certainly they have an IT security department. And I'm not talking about the guy in the weird cargo pants and the beanie who helps you get your login or Outlook. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a proper tech department that builds products and maintains the infrastructure for the company. That's a really interesting field, and it's a growing field. And it's a field where they're in dire need of professionals like you. So the decision I made was, okay, I really enjoy aspects of finance. I particularly love trading, but at the end of the day, I wasn't able to trade. But in the bank that I worked for, and in really all banks, all reputable banks, if you want to trade a stock or a commodity, you need to get approval from your manager and your skip line manager. You have to hold that instrument, whatever it may be, for a minimum of, in my case, it was 30 days. So you've declared it, you've had to get approval, then you've got to hold on to it for 30 days. Trading is already hard enough when you don't have to make all those steps, when you don't have all those hurdles in the way. So the things that I loved about, I wasn't even really doing anymore, certainly not on a personal level. And that's what kind of tweaked my curiosity in tech. Because before you start thinking, that's not something that I can do, think about this for a moment. You don't need to code to be in tech. Tech companies need finance people. Tech companies need salespeople. They need management. They even need a human remains department for some reason. Even if you're not directly producing the code, although I would highly recommend being a software engineer, I'll go into that in another video, but you see the product of your labor. If you're in accounting software business, which let's face it is pretty mundane, but you still see the product that company produces. If you're in robotics, you get to see the robots. If you're building an app, if you're in a company that's building an app, you get to see the benefit to the end user of using that app. It's a broad field, much like finance, where you can go into any number of different disciplines. In tech, you can as well. There's IT security, there's front-end development, there's back-end development. There's many, many areas of tech that you can get into where you actually get to focus on something that you enjoy. You can still trade the market. No one's going to ask you for a 30-day approval. You don't have to go to your boss. You can still buy and sell commodities or stocks or bonds or whatever it may be that you're interested in. You can still work abroad. In fact, you can work more easily abroad than you can with banking and finance, because it doesn't matter if it's JavaScript or Python, it's the same JavaScript or Python, regardless of which country you're in. And tech is more entrepreneurial. I've only ever met one person who managed to set up their own investment bank successfully. There's hundreds and thousands of businesses all around the world in your country that need a tech consultant, and you can help them on the right track. Maybe Ting Tang, maybe that crazy Chinese professor who unfortunately I was never able to get back in touch with because he retired, maybe he was right, and maybe finance is a waste of human potential. At the end of the day, that's up for you to decide. But if you're thinking about a change of career, I can highly recommend tech, and I think you probably have the right skills for it as well. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I hope to see you here soon.